And we're going to be talking about the Oregon Trail, both the computer game and the regular, actual real life one. And Brian is the expert on that. So he's, we call it his history side quest, because whenever he has free time, that's what he wants to talk about and learn about, anything historical. So that's kind of what he's up to. Hi, Mia. And he's going to be telling us about Oregon Trail stuff that he knows. So that's what we're going to start on today. So we had a viral video back in the summer where we showed some original Oregon Trail ruts, and we had so many people come in and try to tell us that that's not what they were, that they were just tire tracks. And so we went viral because we had a bunch of people telling us we were wrong, and that was funny.
Big misunderstandings too.
Yeah, a lot of people just didn't understand the concept. So we are going to talk today about some of those things that we had to explain multiple times, and also Brian's going to talk about some of the things he's already learned and knows. So that's what we're going to do. But we're going to be talking about the Oregon Trail computer game. We're going to be talking about what does the trail look like now? Can you actually visit it? And the answer is yes, you can. And we're going to be talking about some of the things that Brian's learned along the way. Brian was formerly a middle school history teacher and has been a lifelong history fan, as you're going to find out here in a few minutes. We call this his history side quest. So
yeah, I'm a rut nut. I love historic trails. I'm really into historic trails.
Yes, he is.
So Oregon Trails may be the one that I do most often because it's right in my own backyard.
Yeah.
But I don't think it matters where I would live, because if there's a historic trail, I'd be visiting it. So
yep.
I came by it honestly. My dad, when we would go to the Army-Navy store, any Army-Navy surplus people out there, we would go there, and more often than not, there'd be a rack full of books about where to go see ghost towns, and had all the stories and where to go get rocks and things like that. So I think that's where I got started. So.
Yep. All right, so we're going to start answering some questions that Brian is, like I said, kind of the expert. The first question I had was, did you grow up playing the Oregon Trail game?
Yes. Shout out to all Oregon Trail people out there. I was with the original game back when it was green. Green and black
nice.
Screen, green wagon, green mountains, green streams, green
two
everything.
Colors.
Yeah, two colors.
Yeah.
1980, 1985, 1988.
Yeah.
It's basically all I thought about in second grade.
Yeah.
I was one of those boys who let all the women starve because we spent all the money on ammunition to shoot buffalo and
misogyny,
deer.
Anybody?
No, not misogyny,
It's just a little boy who
likes to shoot buffalo.
Right.
So it didn't matter if Aunt Eller got cholera, as long as we had enough money for ammo, it was okay.
Right. Okay.
So
and we currently have a second grader, so I could totally see that being what happens.
Yeah.
So that was a really big game in the 80s, and a lot of millennials and Gen Xers really remember that game. Funny enough, even though I did spend my elementary years here in the United States, I never heard of the Oregon Trail computer game until I met Brian.
That blows my mind, because in my second grade, like, everyone was like fighting over each other to get on it.
So I don't know if it was just that our school district didn't have funds for that or what, but so I had no idea what that was about. But when we showed those Oregon Trail ruts in our video last summer, we had everybody showing up, and there were so many people, and this was really funny to me because it's definitely a generational thing, right? We had so many people show up and be like, you can't still see the Oregon Trail ruts. And we were like, really? That's what you think? That was shocking. But then we had a ton of other people who only knew about the Oregon Trail from the game, from the computer game. And that was also mind-blowing. So that's kind of what we wanted to talk about today. Welcome. And so we talked about you playing the Oregon Trail game. How accurate do you feel like the Oregon Trail computer game from the 80s was compared to the actual Oregon Trail experience that the pioneers went through?
Well, yeah,
1800s.
that would be really hard to, like, If you keep in mind that it was a game for elementary school students in the 80s, I think they did a pretty darn good job.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find pretty encouraging as a history nut is that there's people who still, so many people who still know about the trail because of the game.
Right.
And I would bet that most of you fellow millennials and Gen Xers and folks, that you guys can probably name at least one landmark from the game.
Yeah.
Who doesn't know of dysentery?
Yeah.
You know, like everybody knows these things because of the game. They have made some real improvements. I didn't realize this until recently, but they now have, you know, an updated game
Oh yeah,
on
you guys
Nintendo.
were playing that last night.
No. We were playing the original game, like the original, but they have an updated game now.
Yes.
That probably has changed the most lacking area.
Sure.
You know, the Oregon Trail 80s game was only from a pioneer immigrant perspective.
Right.
In fact, I don't even remember seeing any indigenous peoples at all in the early 80s game. Maybe
Sure.
they were there. But the most recent game, the Nintendo game, they have really brought in the indigenous perspective. You can even play a indigenous person, a Native American person in
Nice.
these games.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. I seem to remember they have African Americans there too. So it's more than just white people and oxen.
Right. So they've improved it, thankfully.
Yeah, you know.
Somewhat.
But I mean,
Yeah.
overall, for an elementary school game, it was pretty accurate and really good in giving you a sense of how difficult it was. It was kind of
Yeah, that was funny.
I mean, I don't know. It seems to me like one of the original history choose your own adventure video games. I know you know, like here
Right.
you had to buy the right stuff.
Yeah.
And if you didn't buy enough stuff, or if you didn't ford the river right,
Right.
you know, you lost it all.
Yeah, well, I mean, last night when you were playing with the kids
Yeah.
on the computer version last night, our kids had never seen the Oregon Trail computer game, and so Brian found it last night online and decided to go and give it a shot, and our kids were sitting around there, and they were all, I could overhear this from the other room, and they were all trying to figure out what they needed to buy to go to the next spot, and then they were going to try and cross the river.
Yeah.
They were like, should we try and ford the river? And they're like, well, okay, it looks good. And so they all, like, they were collaboratively deciding what to do, and they decided to go, and they tried, and, like, half of their supplies fell in the water.
Yeah, it was pretty bad.
It was, for me, being outside the room, not playing, but just listening, it was hilarious to me to hear the kids be like, oh my goodness, look at all this stuff we lost trying to ford the river. We didn't even make it.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's probably one of the big draws of the game, was that all the disasters that kept happening, like, it wasn't that far off from how many disasters the original pioneers would have faced.
Well, yeah, and the setting is really, I mean, for something where you have to enter the code and then, you know, choose one, enter, choose four, enter.
Yeah.
They set it up really well. You know, when you're at the start of the trail, things are relatively inexpensive.
Right.
So we bought, you know, we probably spent a third of our funds getting the stuff we needed, and then we went to we ferried across one river, and that was okay, but it cost us $5 in 2 days.
Yeah.
You know, which is historically accurate for the most part. And then when we tried fording the other river, we lost all of our supply. We lost a ton of stuff.
Yeah.
But we were like, okay, well, let's try to find
up.
somebody to trade. Well, there's
Yeah.
only one person at the time to trade, and they want something that we already lost.
Oops.
So we're stuck, you know.
Right,
And then when we get to Fort Kearney, we go buy things, but of course now it's 30% higher in cost.
Right, because they have to ship it all in,
So that was in many ways the experience of the trail. There are some things that are lacking. You know, at the beginning of the trail, people bought all sorts of things. These middle-class families trying to buy everything they can. Of course, it's kind of like your road trip that people,
Right.
you know, get. If they're not standard road trippers, or if they're a little bit anxious, they buy 3 coats when they need one, and that definitely happened on the trail. As the trail developed, in many ways, it was like this constant thrift store or swap and share, because as you went along, sadly you would see graves, but other things you would see would be piles of stuff. Piles of stuff, like literal
Throw
piles.
it overboard.
Because the oxen are getting tired, and so you're 200 in. You're 100 miles out, and let's see, is it going to be the chest or is it going to be oxen? Well, let's unload the chest and throw the chest out because we need to get to Oregon.
Right.
There's stories about at the forts there being piles of bacon because people bought way too much bacon. So you think about just piles.
Oh man, that's sad. All the bacon. Oh man.
So that isn't in the game, but I mean, second grade game. What do you expect, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, so we visited several Oregon Trail sites in the last few months, local to where we are here. We live in Silverton, Oregon, and so we're right in the Willamette Valley, which is where the trail basically ended. And so there's a lot of sites here where we can interact with different things. And one of the things that shocked me when I started learning about the actual Oregon Trail experience, like the historical Oregon Trail, was the fact that if you were older than 5, you were going to be walking for most of it.
Yeah.
And I mean, okay, so our youngest is, about 7 years old here, and I can't fathom him walking from Missouri to Oregon over the course of a summer, or even over a course of a couple of years if you stopped somewhere. No wonder it was such a difficult thing to do. So so nobody caught dysentery on your video game, your computer game last night, right?
No,
dysentery.
Our second-born daughter got the measles.
Playing last night on the game,
and she chose the name Goober, so Goober got the measles, which I think it's self-explanatory. If you're going to call yourself Goober, then I guess you get measles.
Bummer.
So.
Right, so our kids were learning a lot about it, but disease was. I mean, let's talk a little bit about disease. Like, how big of an issue was that on the Oregon Trail?
Yeah, it was huge. Yeah. It was huge, especially waterborne diseases.
Yeah.
I mean, when they say you have died of dysentery on the game, that was a real thing.
Yeah.
Dysentery was widespread in much of the United States, especially where you had issues of food contamination and water contamination.
Sure, yeah.
So on the trail where everyone's been camping. How clean are things after 5 days of camping?
Yeah.
And if you can imagine camping while you're steadily going across the plains and the Rockies, that was a real issue.
Yeah.
A lot of it was again issues of contaminated water. Actually, one of the biggest killers. While dysentery was always there, probably one of the biggest killers was cholera. There was a cholera epidemic that happened at the same time as when the trail was really at its height.
Yeah.
And that spread right into the Platte River Valley, we call the Platte River Road, the Great Platte River Road.
So that was in Nebraska.
Exactly. It's that stretch that everyone thinks about when you think about Oregon Trail. Sure. You got Chimney Rock there. Right. You've got Scotts Bluff.
Some of the famous sites, which you can still visit now.
Yeah.
A lot of those are sites that people go to when they're learning about the Oregon Trail.
And when you think about that, you think, oh, wow, this is so beautiful. It's so amazing. And even the immigrants, when they're writing it, are writing about how beautiful and remarkable and scenic it is.
Yeah.
And yet at the same token, as you came through that area, as these immigrants were going through, they saw gravesite upon gravesite upon gravesite upon gravesite because the cholera epidemic just raged among the wagon trains.
Yeah, I mean, and cholera is just it's just a killer. I mean, even nowadays, in some countries, in some of the poorer countries of the world, if cholera shows up, they have to call in help immediately from the World Health Organization and places like that, because cholera is it spreads so fast and it kills people really quickly. And so it's not surprising to me that the Oregon Trail was so deadly.
Well, and you can think about how one death would quickly lead to another death, because with the wagon trains were a community effort.
Right.
It was not a wise thing to go out and simply just go out on your own.
Right.
I think of a story from Little House on the Prairie, which, as we know, those were generally her memories.
Right.
Where there was a single wagon train that the Ingalls come upon, out there, and someone had stolen their horses,
right?
Their horses, which, by the way, if they were using horses, these people haven't adequately prepared, because you didn't take horses on the trail.
Yeah, but take oxen because they last better on the scrub land. Like they could feed better on what was actually available to eat on the trail.
Yeah, oxen and mules, not donkeys. Oxen and mules were the preferred ones. Horses was a very poor choice for the trail. But someone had stolen their horses, and now they were stuck
in the middle of the desert,
in the middle of prairie land with no one to help them.
Yeah.
So people would go out in communities, going back to what I was saying, and it was a community effort to protect to have safety in numbers, but also a community effort just to get the wagons over certain areas. Like one of the highest hills that immigrant wagons had to come over on the trail is known as California Hill. It's not in California. It's actually in the Great Plains. If I remember right, it's in Nebraska. And the grade was so difficult that it involved unpacking the wagons and carefully bringing them over. Well, if you have a family of 10, that's going to be a hard job when you're talking about getting it over. But if you have a group of 50, 80, you can do that. But then if cholera comes in and takes out half.
Oh yeah. I mean, and it was cholera would just it would take out huge numbers.
So then you have the real potential of the party not making it over these passes, not making it in time, running out of time, running out of supplies. So one death leads to another.
Wow. All right. So great. Yeah. So that's so we've been impressed to see. I think that's one of the neat things about researching historic trails like this, is just the understanding that, and there are problems with it, right? Like it's not like, we're not saying that we're not making a moral judgment as to whether or not going and taking land from other people was a good plan. Obviously we don't agree with that. But you do have to recognize that the people who chose to do this, they weren't picking an easy route. They were choosing to do something that was incredibly difficult at the time. And they had to have the fortitude to make it. So tell me a little bit about how long the Oregon Trail was. Tell me about where it started. Let's hear a little bit about what it was like.
Well, I think something you said there about motivation, and the trail is complex when you get into. There was racism, there was slavery, there was injustice that was definitely involved. But I think we also need to recognize that this was a movement of people, and it's not as cut and dry as all of these people made a plan and did something that was illegal. In many ways, social media is similar. We've run into this situation where there's a mass movement taking place, and some of the things are good and some of the things are terrible when it comes to social media. Well, who do you blame? Well, you could blame the founders, I suppose, to a degree. How much are we to blame as creators? How much, it's complicated, I guess is the way to put it. And not everyone was doing it for the same reason.
Sure.
This was one of the largest mass migrations in history, and calling it a migration, I think, is the most accurate way to understand it. Because while there was, you can say the Oregon Trail, it was more like the Oregon Trails. What we follow when we take the trail route, the auto tour, is kind of the primary route that most people took. But there were lots of cutoffs, lots of different ways to do the trail.
Sure, and it changed over time too, right?
Absolutely,
they would find a route that worked better. Some of the sites we visited this summer were places where people were trying to solve a problem of how do we get past Mount Hood? How do we get past the river? And so there are several different spots that were tried until they kind of settled on one that worked really well, right?
Yeah, and I think that's really important, that the trail itself was not some static thing. It developed and evolved over history. I mean, they were using the trail right into the 1910s to be able, and in some parts of the trail, like the one we saw there at Biggs Junction, it's still getting used. It's still getting used.
I mean, it leads off into farmland now.
But it continued being used as a wagon trail and even an auto trail for quite some time before the highway system got going, and even especially before the railroads. And so getting to your question specifically, the trail had several starting points.
Right.
If we start at where the trail really began to pick up,
right,
in the early 1840s, the primary starting point was in Missouri.
Right.
And there were a couple reasons for that. Western Missouri, well, first of all, Missouri really had been the gateway to the West since the purchase of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, right?
Like that, yeah.
And so that was, St. Louis and Missouri was kind of just a stop along the way for the French traders in New France, but New France was oriented north to south. Well, the United States and its orientation was east to west.
Yeah.
So that made Missouri kind of the staging point,
right.
For anything they would do westward.
Sure.
We had Lewis and Clark, we had the Astor Party, all of those came out of St. Louis.
Right.
By the time you get to the early 1840s, the westernmost part of the frontier is not St. Louis on the east, but it's Kansas City region on the west.
Right.
And Missouri in 1843 was the westernmost state.
Right.
And so right there, most wagon trains left in the Kansas City region, and Independence, Missouri is regarded as kind of like the official start of the trail.
Right.
And so in that region, people could get the logistics they needed and launch, literally leave the westernmost state, cross the border into the Louisiana, what was, the remaining portion of the Louisiana Territory, the Kansas Prairie, all of this unorganized territory.
Right.
More than that, the Kansas City region was the starting point and had been the starting point for the Santa Fe Trail for quite some time. So it already had the machinery and logistics available for a wagon train.
Yeah.
So Kansas City region, Independence, Missouri, they in fact, for the first few miles to get out of the state, they followed the Santa Fe Trail southwest before turning northwest and heading over Kansas Prairie. And altogether is about 2,200 miles, 2,165 miles, depending on how well you did.
So from Missouri to Oregon.
Yeah, to the Willamette Valley, Oregon.
Which is where we live now.
Yeah, if you're going to go it that way. Now again, just like Oregon had, the migration had many starting points, it also had many ending points.
Sure.
When people said Oregon back in the 1840s, they didn't mean the state of Oregon.
Right.
They meant Oregon Territory. And that really, Oregon Territory was anything from the western slope of the Rockies all the way out to the Pacific, running from the border of California, which was Mexican California at the time, soon to be American, American,
Right. No, it's 50s,
all the way up to all the way up to what's now British Columbia.
So we're talking about the modern states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, bits of Montana, some of Utah probably.
Yeah, not really Utah, but I mean might be, but I don't think so. It was basically really Oregon Territory was present day Oregon, Washington, much of Idaho, and parts of Montana, and then right up far into the province of British Columbia.
Yeah, probably Alberta a little bit too.
Yeah, the Louisiana Purchase was defined as the drainage for the Mississippi.
Right.
So it would basically be the Continental Divide along the Rockies.
Okay.
So we're talking about that part. So when people were coming to Oregon, the ending point for them wasn't necessarily the Willamette Valley. You also had people going up into Washington, into Olympia, Washington, and places like that, Tumwater and other places.
Yeah. When we were traveling this summer, we visited a few of the Washington locations for the Oregon Trail too, which I didn't even realize were there. But one of the ones we visited was the mission in the Walla Walla area, the Whitman mission.
Yeah.
And so there's just, when you're out here in the west, in the western part of the U.S., but especially here in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Northern California, the trail is everywhere. There are bits and pieces of Oregon Trail history everywhere in these states. And a lot of the major highways were built on the Oregon Trail. And important to note too, I think, which is something that didn't occur to me until we started learning more about it, is that a lot of these trails weren't even original to the Oregon Trail migration.
Yeah.
They were indigenous peoples' trails that they had used before that, or buffalo trails, or that's how a trail works. you know, you might use some of you try and look for something that's already in use, because usually they've already found the easiest routes.
Yeah.
So, all right, so we've got, okay, so another question here. How much of the Oregon Trail can still be seen today? Like the actual, I mean, we've seen some ruts.
Yeah.
And of course, the really famous ones that most people, if they've heard of it, realize are there are like in Nebraska and Wyoming. They're deep ruts that are, you know, feet wide. You can walk in them, and they actually went through sandstone and stuff.
Yeah.
But like, how much of it can we still see nowadays?
Yeah. You can see, there's thousands of miles of the trail that is preserved.
Right.
And there's a few reasons for that.
Right.
One of them is because of, like, basically, what is the word? It becomes packed earth. Mm-hmm. You know, you think about the millions of feet and hooves and wagon tires and later automobile tires that went over. Those parts, those ruts remain. And again, some of them are not merely packed earth. Some of them are, as you said, actual rock. You go to the Guernsey ruts in Wyoming, and you can see there's deep ruts.
Yeah, they basically mean like a
that
channel.
aren't going away. And by the way, that's not unique to the Oregon Trail. Right. There are places in Kingman, Arizona. There are wagon ruts you can go to that were for the stagecoach. We even have here in Oregon on the coast stagecoach ruts on coastal rocks where the stagecoach would make the pass during the low tide, and you can actually see the ruts at a tide pool, which is pretty wild. And that might sound super crazy to some of you, but if you go to the Oregon coast, you'll totally understand why they would be so determined, because there aren't a lot of places to drive on the Oregon coast, at least before the highway was built. So that's pretty much what they had. But there's a lot of places where regular use left a mark. Yeah. And much of Nebraska, much of Wyoming, a lot of these places that are still undeveloped have been used as ranch land. Yeah. In some cases, you know, when there's been farmland, then the ruts are annihilated.
Sure, yeah, because you plow through it, basically.
Another reason why so many of the ruts still exist is because of the effort on the part of conservationists. Sure. And we might be surprised at this, but the work of conservation of the trail actually is over 100 years old. Yeah. Much of the trail we know about because of a man by the name of Meeker, who left Meeker markers. And he went over the trail himself multiple times.
There was an awesome photo someone sent us.
Yeah, he went over the trail when he went over the trail as a regular immigrant. And then later on, as he aged, he said, hey, this is history I want to preserve. Yeah. And so he created markers. Right. And it was the first real effort, and he worked very, very much with the United States government and with efforts of conservation to make sure that the trail was preserved. Right. And so that effort has been underway for a long time. So, you know, these are things, even in areas where there's more erosion. I think about the Barlow Road here in Oregon.
Right, where it like rains and snows for half the year in that spot.
Yeah, you wouldn't think that the Barlow Road on Mount Hood would still be preserved. Well, the ruts you can't see anymore. But what you can see is you can see the swales. Right. Because as wagons are coming through again and again.
Right, and what is a swale compared to a rut?
Yeah.
I think that's something people misunderstand too.
Well, so this might be the amateur side of me, but my understanding is that swales are more like, they're like hills that develop.
Kind of like an indentation, kind of?
Well, like you're going to see a ridge that develops on either side. So you may not have the actual ruts themselves, the actual indentations on the ground. Right. But you might have some earthworks that have developed from... That's my understanding
area of a lower ground.
Now, if someone has a better definition, I'd love to hear it, because I'm always learning. Mm-hmm. And like you can see, this is my hobby horse. I don't have a PhD in this, but I do know something about it. So you can see the swales, and you can see areas where they've moved the rocks off.
Yeah.
So even there, where it's raining all the time, it's still there, and that shouldn't surprise us.
Well, and on the Barlow Road on Mount Hood, like we said, like the trails, there's just so much rain and snow in half of the year there that the actual ruts are not as easy to see, but there are actual trees there that got scraped when they were pulling wagons through and lifting things. Like there are spots where you can see trees that were damaged as the Oregon Trail immigrants were coming through.
I think what you're thinking of there actually is not so much them rolling past, but there's a part on the Barlow Road called Laurel Hill where the grade was so steep that they would have to lower the wagons down, and what they would do is they would tie ropes around tree trunks, and as they were lowering the wagons, the friction basically burned the trunks. It left impressions on the trunks, and those can still be seen if you're willing to hunt and look. So there is evidence for the trail all along, and of course there's graves. A lot of people you can still find graves throughout the trail that are marked. Many of the graves were unmarked, so it's been a work that people have done to find those. But there's a lot that have been marked and that you can still see.
Well, when you're talking about preservation, something that I've learned a lot since we had this video go viral about the Oregon Trail, mostly because I've had all these questions come in that I didn't know the answer to, and so I would ask Brian or I would look it up. But one of the things that I learned in this process is that there are groups that travel the Oregon Trail now, the Oregon and California trails. There's actually a club group, association, whatever you want to call it, that is committed to not just knowing about these places, but visiting them. And I guess a lot of the Latter-day Saints, it's one of their projects to do the Oregon Trail. Like a lot of kids do it as teens. A lot of LDS teens do it as a project to go along the Pioneer Trail and stuff. So there's preservation happening, but there's also the fact that a lot of these trails are still in use. Well, being used for roads or being used by whatever group is interested.
Yeah, and I think bringing in the Mormons is a great example here too, because the part of the trail that is best preserved, which is the great what would you call it, the Great Platte Road, basically 600 plus miles of trail running along the Platte and North Platte River through Nebraska and Wyoming. Again, it wasn't merely immigrants going to Oregon that took that route. That part is actually also called the Emigrant Trail because that was the route that the Mormons took. You can look up the Mormon Trail. The Mormons took that route. Those going to California took that route. So you're talking about millions of people.
It's not just a small couple of people. Absolutely.
There. So it's not surprising that in that area that's largely undeveloped and mostly arid, that it's still there.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. I'm trying to see if I have any other questions. Hey, if you have questions about the Oregon Trail, the National Historic Trail, or just the history of it, or even about the game, feel free to type them in the chat. We'd love to hear them. Let's see. But we're coming to the end of our live here. So I think there's more. How long did it take to traverse most of the Oregon Trail? Like say you were leaving from Kansas or Missouri. Let's start with Missouri. Say you were leaving from the Missouri area and then you were trying to get to Oregon. Like what time of year would you want to leave? And if you were trying to get there, like could you make it in one spring, summer, fall, or would you need to break it up into pieces?
Yeah. So, generally speaking, they needed to do it in one go. To try to set up winter quarters was a dangerous thing for several reasons.
Sure.
I mean, you need to have a large mass of people to make something work.
Right, and the plains are like known for blizzards and cold and stuff.
Well, and there are areas where you're not going to find wildlife. The Astor Party in the early 1800s, they traversed an area that was largely similar, basically followed the trail for much of the way. And they ran into the very issue of not being able to find people to trade with,
Right.
not being able to find food to hunt.
Right.
And that seems kind of crazy when you think about how much wildlife there was back then, how many
Right.
indigenous people there are. But go out to the west. Go out to the west, and it might be a long time to find people.
Right. I mean, that's why a lot of the nomadic tribes would follow the buffalo, because that was their food source.
Exactly.
And the buffalo there's a lot of them, but only
Yeah.
in certain places, and they're on the move.
Yeah.
So.
And both with Lewis and Clark and with the Astor Party,
Yeah.
they ran into moments of starvation
Sure.
in the Rockies looking for people.
Right.
And they would come across indigenous tribes, and the people would see them and run because
Right.
they didn't know what to think.
Right,
And
sure.
They were like, I'm not going to let you kill me today.
Yeah, yeah.
And,
Right.
and so you think about, the core of Discovery was like 30 plus men,
Yeah.
and a woman and child, right?
Yeah.
You can think about how much more difficult that is when you're talking about carrying wagons.
Sure, yeah.
So
they tried to make it in a 6-month period.
They
roughly.
really did. Yeah, they endeavored to leave in the spring. There were different ways to go about it. If you left in March, April, on one hand, you had more time, but you were also more likely to deal with spring weather and
Right.
to deal with flooded streams.
Right, right.
But you wanted to get over the Rockies during, the
You
summertime.
only have a couple months to do that.
You need
yeah.
to get over
the
those
rest of the time
Rockies.
it's snowy.
And then if later immigrants, when the Barlow Road was open, would want to get over the Cascades with
Right.
snow if they can.
Yeah.
Between the Rockies and the Cascades are the Blue Mountains in eastern Oregon.
Right.
So there are some mountains, but especially the most important one was getting over the Rockies over South Pass.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So
So
it was basically a half-year endeavor, and you needed to try to get it done in that amount
yeah,
of time.
and you wanted to try to find a way to be in Oregon,
Right.
if possible in October,
Right.
September. If you can do that, November.
Yeah.
I mean, you need to get there quick.
Right.
October and November were really dicey times to be able to get here, and a lot of folks tried to find other ways to get here.
Sure.
And the Applegate train is probably the Applegate Trail is probably the most famous example of that.
Sure.
And they ran into the thing that they were trying to avoid.
Right. Yeah.
So
Okay. So we're going to wrap it up here for today, but are there any other questions, those of you who've been watching, if there's any questions we can answer for you, we'd love to do that. Brian has read multiple books on the Oregon Trail, besides being a teacher, so that's something he really knows quite a bit about. But welcome, glad to see you here today.
we didn't get into great places to see on the Oregon Trail, but that's where I think we're headed. There's
Yeah.
so many cool things to see.
Yeah, we're gonna
we
talk about
love
some of the
going
cool
there with
sites
our
we've seen,
family.
yeah.
It's fun.
Yeah, thank you. So heart the screen if you've appreciated this, and we will see you guys next week probably.
Happy Saturday!
Happy Saturday, guys.